that they are the least understood ingredient, which I find fascinating, the newest ingredient. They weren't actually used until about 1300, 1400 on a regular basis. We've been brewing beer for 8,000 years. So they're the newest ingredient. And the funniest thing about it is that they're least necessary. You will have beer without hops. You won't have beer without water. You won't have beer without yeast, and you won't have beer without malted barley. But without hops, you'll still have an alcoholic malt beverage. Might not be the beer as we know it, but they're not that necessary. But they're incredibly popular. And the Americans have really grabbed onto it recently. It used to be, back in the 70s, they would advertise beers as being better, not bitter. They did not want you to have a bitter beer. There was only one IPA in all of the United States before homebrew was made legal, and it was Valentine. Valentine Ale was an IPA, and they used to put it in green bottles. And one thing that happens with hops, and you should all know this, but I'll tell you anyway, is that hops react to light. It's called light striking, and they react specifically to the blue wavelength of light. And when the blue wavelength hits the hop oils, it's a riboflavin in the hop oils, they create the same chemical compound as skunks. And that's why beers skunk in green bottles, because they don't actually filter out the blue light. So why anyone packages in green bottles is beyond. Miller uses a hop extract so that they can package in their clear bottles and not skunk. They have that riboflavin removed. And they learned a lot about flavor of hops. Miller Coors, believe it or not, have done a great amount of hop research. And they've learned a lot about flavor of hops just from using these extracts. I'm going to talk a little bit about it later on, but they found that they lost some flavors due to that. Hops are interesting also. There are two colleges that I know of that have entire programs dedicated just to hops because they're so enigmatic. I did a lot of research where they're finding out ways to use hops as a preservative, just to actually take the preservative quality out and have it as a preservative for other things besides beer. And hops are also a natural preservative, and that's one of the reasons why people started using it. But I'll talk about that when I talk about the history a little bit. So this is going to be the overview of the class. I'm going to talk about the history of hops, and I'm not going to go too much into it because, like Ramon said, I don't care about history. It's not where I'm going to be. I'd like to know what's happening now. So the history could be an entire semester on hops, believe it or not. So I'll just scratch it a little bit, and then I'm going to talk to you about hops, what they are and what they're made of, and what to expect from your hops. And then the alpha and beta acids, the alpha acid being a bittering resin, and the beta acids actually being a non-isomerized resin that's also in hops that is not as important to us as homebrewers, but nice to know about. We're going to talk about the measurement of bitterness, how we measure bitterness, and the measurement being IBUs, the amount of isomerized alpha acid that actually gets into the wort. And I'm going to talk about aroma, which is the most important part of hops. Because they know, I don't want to say the most important part, but they know about alpha acids and isomerization and bitterness, and this is something they still do research on, but it's pretty strong science. It's the aroma that they're learning more and more and more about by doing different tests. And I'll talk a little bit about tests that you can do for aroma and flavors. So I have this little hop tea going. We're going to taste this later on. Should be good. And then I'm going to talk about the different hop products available. There's about a dozen different products that you can get besides just pellets and leaves. And the best ways to use hops, and that's going to be the most practical part of this class, is the ways to use hops and why and how. And one thing about using hops is that you don't know how a hop is going to affect your beer until you make a beer with it. That is the one truism of hops. So you can do whatever you want as far as rubbing hops and making teas and taking baths in it, but until you actually have fermented beer, that's the only way you're going to know how a single hop's going to react, how two different hops will react with each other. So beer experimentation is the way to learn about hops. So I encourage you to keep brewing and bring me some. And then the factors that affect the bitterness and aroma, the different things that you can actually adjust your bitterness, to adjust your aromatic properties, the things that you can look out for. One of them being light. Light is your enemy. We'll talk a little bit about growing hops at home. Again, it's probably the one thing I should never teach, is growing anything. But I will give you some information. And then we're going to do the tasting. In today's tasting, I made the same beer 8 times in a row with a different single hop. So these are a pale ale, each bittered knocked out and then dry hop at the exact same hop. So they have varying IBUs because I went by amount of hops, not by IBUs. I didn't try to keep the beers the same bitterness. So after the class is done, you should have a better idea of what you're looking for and different flavors and stuff that come from the different hops. So one thing that I regret not doing is doing a couple of dual hop things, because when you put two hops together, it changes the entire chemical compound inside the wort. So it will make an even different flavor than the two single hops alone. Hops. And the way hops work as a preservative is they work on what's called gram-positive bacteria. It's a test that they do on bacteria. Some are gram-positive, some are gram-negative. It's the charge of the bacteria. So hops will actually stop gram-positive bacteria from reproducing. And that's how they work as a preservative. It's mainly the beta acids that do this. Something that's gram-negative that it won't work on is yeast. So hops don't stop yeast from reproducing. So that's why hops really work well in beer, so that you can actually stop spoilage from happening but still have bacteria in it. One of the other gram-negative bacteria, though, that exist is acetobacter. And acetobacter is what creates vinegar. So your beer can still turn to vinegar even if it's highly hopped. Acetobacter, just as a little side note, needs oxygen in order to reproduce. So during primary fermentation, you have so much CO2 happening, you don't have to worry about an oxygen environment. But after the primary is done and you start letting the beer sit, you have to watch out for oxidation, because if you did get some acetobacter in there, that's the only way they're going to reproduce is in aerobic environments, and then they'll create vinegar. So most vinegar problems are caused by two things. One is improper sanitation, and the other one is oxidation. So oxygen is not your friend, especially post-fermentation. You really have to be careful of that. That's why I don't use secondary fermentation. The only time I'll do a secondary fermentation, and going off of hops and going into fermentation, but they all work together, is if I need to let my beer sit a long time, like because it has a high molecular weight alcohol in it, there's fusel alcohols in it, and they need to break down over time, you need to let it sit, it needs to store. So I will put it into a secondary off of the yeast cake, and I'll always purge that secondary with CO2 so that I don't put it into an oxygen-rich environment. I want to make sure it's sitting away from light, away from oxygen for as long as possible. The other time I'll do a secondary will be for dry hopping. And I rarely do it, actually. I do dry hopping in primaries, but the reason why you want to do it in the secondaries is a lot of the essential oils can actually be caught by the yeast true and dropped out. So people prefer to put their beer into secondary for dry hopping so that they don't have as much yeast to actually drop the oils out. And yeast actually, as they are fermenting, will break some of the oils down in the fermentation process. So getting it off the yeast is important. I'll talk more about it later when we talk about dry hopping, but one experiment I read recently was dry hopping with filtered or unfiltered beer. The filtered beer with the dry hopping actually broke down, because the yeast are enzyme bags, and their enzyme broke down a lot of the different components that were in the hop oils, whereas the unfiltered beer did not. It actually smelled more like the hops profile. The filtered beer. The filtered beer gave it a completely different aromatic profile. Most homebrewers don't filter their beer, so it's not something that you're not going to, it's going to be of any concern to you. The males are used for pollination, so they do grow male hops for crossbreeding and just for breeding. But we only use the female flower. They grow on a vine up to 20, sometimes 25 feet. So if you see a picture of a hop farm, I don't have one, but they're huge walls of hops. And they grow long. One of the biggest problems with hops are harvesting. It's difficult to harvest because the vines are so tall. So they use these special machines to harvest them. They need to harvest them quickly. Again, they rot on the vine pretty quickly. As I said before, they grow well wherever potatoes are grown. Now, the thing that is most important for a hop, and we have some Simcoe hops here if you want to grab whole leaf Simcoe, it's the lupulin gland. The lupulin gland is that yellow stuff in the middle. As a friend of mine calls it, the lupulicious. And that contains the essential oils and the bittering resins that are used in the brewing process. Hops are a natural preservative and a natural sedative, as I said before. So people are using them more and more in teas and that sort of thing. They do help with head retention and foam stability. So hoppier beers, I don't know if you've ever noticed, IPAs tend to have rockier heads because they contain polyphenols, and they also contain, which is a type of tannin, which helps to bind to the head and keep it from dissipating as quickly. So they do help with head retention. A land-raised hop is a hop that is basically like a terroir hop, a hop that is known for its area. Certain land-raised hops are Kent Goldens. They're known to be grown in Kent. Hallertau, Tettnang, Saaz. These are all what we call land-raised hops, but they're not land-raised unless, especially in Germany, unless they have ER at the end. So if you get a Hallertau hop, it's more likely grown in America. It's still the same strain of hop, but if it's a Hallertauer, then it was grown in Hallertau in Germany. Tettnanger was grown in Tettnang. So there are only a couple of ones that are considered land-raised hops, and that also means that they weren't crossbred. They're basically wild hops that have been used. I guess an example of an American land-raised hop would be Amarillo. Amarillo was not crossbred to become Amarillo. It was just a mistake. It was growing in a field of Liberty hops, and then they saw it and they did testing on it, and they said this is a brand new hop, and incredibly stupidly made it proprietary to that farm. And Amarillo could only be grown in one farm for a while, and they had one bad Amarillo crop, and then the guy started selling off his rhizomes so that they could be grown other places, because it's really not a good idea, as the Irish potato famine showed us, to just grow one crop, one spot. One disease comes in and you lost the whole. Spalter, and Tettnanger. Those are the noble hops, and they're known for a specific aroma, which is what they consider floral and earthy. But noble hops are just a term that was made up in the 1980s, to try to sell these hops. So these hops are all from Tettnang, they're all from one strain, basically. And then some salesmen made up the idea of noble hops. So you say, these are noble. But one way that you can tell noble hops is if the alpha acid and beta acid are 1-to-1 ratio. That usually signals a noble hop. But those are the only 6 that are considered noble. There are nearly noble hops, which have similar aromas, and those would be Kent Golden, Fuggles, and you could probably call Willamette a nearly noble hop as well. So whenever you hear the term, you'll hear it a lot of times, and Sam Adams has a series of beers made with noble hops, right? They have the noble hop.
Noble pills.
Pills, right? Yeah. So a lot of times you'll just hear with a beer style, use a noble hop, right? That just means using one of those 6 very floral, mellow kind of German flavors. So right now we're at what the meat of what we get from our hops, and those are alpha acids, beta acids, and aromatic oils. The main alpha acids that are in your hops are called humulone, cohumulone, and adhumulone. And they're the main bittering acids that are in the hop resin. This is what gets into the beer to create bitterness in our beer. A high percentage of cohumulone, anything over 30%, is considered harsh bittering. And when you see a hop sheet, they won't tell you the other 2 alpha acids percentage. They will always tell you the cohumulone. So a higher cohumulone, harsher bitterness; lower cohumulone, less bitterness. But there's people nowadays that are saying that if you use a high cohumulone hop but for less of a boil, like take enough high cohumulone to get to a certain IBU and only boil it for about 20 minutes, you will have a much more pleasant bitterness. You won't get that cohumulone sharpness. I haven't done a lot of experiments myself on that, but one of the tastes that we're going to do today is a high cohumulone and a low cohumulone hop at the same alpha acids, and you can taste the difference, hopefully, in the bitterness and how it actually affects the bitter flavors. So an example of a high cohumulone hop would be Chinook. Brewer's Gold is super high cohumulone. It turns out Mosaic is also a high cohumulone hop.
Botanimals too.
Botanimals? Yeah.
That's co-H on
Yeah.
forms.
Yeah. That's why they tell you. They don't tell you the other one. If you take a look, I gave you also a separate hop sheet for both Amarillo and Teton, or Teton. And that also gives you the co-unulin amount and the alpha acid and the beta acid amount. So that's 3 things already that you will know from looking at your hop sheet. And this will give you the general alpha acids for the actual strain. The alpha acid itself in the hop is available on the packages. And they actually, as soon as they pick the hop, they test the alpha acid. So one thing about getting the proper amount of IBUs into your beer is that you don't know what the actual alpha acid of the hop you're getting is. You only know what it was when it was picked. As time goes by, alpha acids degrade. So the only way you can really know the alpha acid of your hop would be to do a test yourself on it. And I don't know how you would go about doing that. So that's one of the variables in figuring out what your IBUs are in your wort is the fact that you don't know exactly what your alpha acids are in your hop. Depends on how it was stored, depends on how old it is. The fresher the hop, the better. That's why September through December is the best time for brewing. Right now, all our hops are super, super fresh. By next October, we're still going to have the same harvest. There's nothing we can really do about it unless we get Southern Hemisphere hops, which we do. But now's the time to brew. Just so you know. So get brewing. Acid won't just make your water bitter. They need to actually go through a chemical process called isomerization. They need to be boiled. So what it does is it takes a molecular structure of the hop and reconfigures it into an iso-alpha acid, an isomer of the actual acid, and it makes it soluble. So the longer you boil the hop, the more isomerization is going to happen to your hop, and the more soluble it is.
So that's why you put it in 5 minutes. Whatever.
The 60-minute addition will be the bittering, because that's going to have the most isomerization.
Yeah.
But the essential oils in a hop are volatile, they boil well. So by adding at the end, you're not boiling off your essential oils, but you're also not isomerizing your hop.
I see.
Hence why your house smells so great.
Huh?
Hence why the house smells great.
Right.
You know.
That's why the house smells so great. So it increases isomerization to a point. Between 60-minute boil and 90-minute boil is only a couple of percent more isomerized hops. So that's why we use 60-minute, because it's pretty much the most that you can isomerize a hop. So yeah, alpha acids degrade with time, keep them airtight and cold. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about isomerization and measuring IBUs, what they call utilization. So isomerizing a hop is one thing, but the amount of iso-alpha acid that actually get into the wort is the utilization of the hop. It's the amount that we actually get. The hop you would use, what, 2/3 to get to 10 alpha acid units. So a lot of recipes, when it comes to bittering, won't even tell you what hop to use. They'll tell you the amount of alpha acid units to use to hit the IBUs that are needed for that recipe. They almost always only do that for bittering, not for the other additions. Just say alpha acid units. Make sure you have 20 alpha acid units. So you can use 2 ounces of 10, or 1 ounce of 15, 1 ounce of 5. It always adds up to whatever alpha acid units that you want. The hops nowadays are telling you beta acids on them as well, and they're not that important to home brewer. They're more important to brewers, but it's a nice thing to know about. Beta acids cannot isomerize. You boil them, and they do not actually change their. They do not reconfigure, just like the alpha acids. The way you can actually make a beta acid soluble is through oxidation. So a lot of breweries will use high beta acid hops, so that as the beer ages in the bottle, the alpha acid bitterness tends to go away with time, and then the beta acid will come in as the beer naturally oxidizes. I don't even know how to figure that out, like how to know how much to use so that it maintains a consistent bitterness, but these laboratories, these breweries do. And I guess it's more for beers that are going to sit a long time. They want to make sure there's some beta acid in there. Beta acid also contains a lot of the preservative qualities that are considered to be gram-positive preservative qualities. 2 to 1 alpha to beta content will keep beer at consistent bitterness as it ages. I don't know. Whenever I look at my acid content on my hops, I almost always just ignore the beta because I'm more concerned with the IBUs. I drink my beers quickly, I don't really let them store, so I should try.
Surprises me.
Yeah, I should try some storage, experiments, but I haven't. They do contain some aromatic properties, but not so much as the essential oils do. The essential oils are the most important part for aroma. So now measuring the bitterness, measured in the International Bitterness Units. That's how we measure bitterness in a beer. The Americans are the only ones that call it IBUs. The rest of the world call them BUs, just bitterness units. So I don't know why we put the international there. I'm surprised we don't call it ABU, American Bitterness Units. So it's the percentage of alpha acid that gets into the wort is the utilization. IBUs are 1 milligram per liter of iso-alpha acid equals 1 IBU. That's how it's measured. They use spectrometers to measure it. The longer the boil, the higher the alpha acid of the hop. The lower the gravity of the boil, the higher the utilization. Now this is something really interesting, the gravity of the wort. For the longest time, it was thought that the higher the gravity of the wort, the less utilization, because there was more sugar in the actual water molecules and less utilization of the hops. So that you need to use more hops or higher alpha acid to hit the same IBU with a high gravity wort than you would with a lower gravity wort. All the math has been done with boil time and gravity for utilization as a percentage. Just recently, within the last 6 months, there's been a lot of work looking into it saying it wasn't gravity at all. It's what we call break. When you do your boil, especially if you're doing all grain, there's a binding of proteins at the beginning of the boil. That is called the hot break. They are proteins that bind and then drop out of solution. Palmer is now saying, and there are other people that are agreeing with him, that the loss of IBUs, the loss of the actual utilization of the alpha acids is caused by the break. So as we add hops, the break is pulling out some of the IBUs. So when they did tests, it was always higher gravity beers, sure, get less utilization, but it wasn't because of the gravity of the beer, it was because there was more break. As extract brewers, you have less break. A lot of that break is made during the actual extracting of the sugars, and we'll get some. So when you bring your wort to a boil, you have a chance of boiling over, that's the break.
There's some homebrewers that actually will skim off some of the hop break that comes in the beginning of the boil to try to avoid that, but you still can't really fully avoid it.
Settle first. I mean,
Well,
boil it, get the hot breaks, wrap it off.
Skimming it, well, I guess you could do that, but you never want to transfer your wort hot. You can oxidize the wort and cause
No,
hot
yeah, you
aeration.
have to let it cool.
We skimmed a couple of times and found that we had less head retention because
That's protein.
while we were skimming off the break, but I think we were skimming off proteins that would actually get into the beer. So after doing it a couple of times, it was easier for us to clean. We didn't get clogs, but we found that we got better quality beer by allowing the break to stay in. Reason why this is actually important for extract brewers is that extract brewers tend to do partial boils, right? So when every one of our recipes, when you do a 3-gallon boil for a 5-gallon batch, we always have you split the extracts. We have you start off with half the extract so that you get proper utilization of the alpha acid, so that it's actually at a gravity of, let's say, 1040, because it's only 3 gallons. We add all the extract in, it's concentrated, so you'll be at a gravity of about 1070, depending on the beer, before you dilute it with water. So you have a high gravity, less utilization. This is what Palmer's saying isn't true, because since it's extract, there's less break. The gravity shouldn't matter. And they've been doing tests on it that doing partial wort as opposed to full wort comes out with the exact same utilization, exact same IBU. I haven't done tests myself on it, so I don't know, but all the software will ask whether you're doing late boil additions, and they will change your IBUs according to that. So they're still thinking that it is the actual gravity of the solution. The one thing you can do, especially if you're an all-grain brewer and you bring your wort to a boil, let it boil for a half hour before adding your first hop addition. So do a 90-minute boil, and then let it boil for a half hour. Make sure all that break is broken and dropped out, and then add your hop addition. You should get much better utilization.
Right.
So the one thing about utilization is you can always add more hops.
Yeah.
But you need to know.
If you know.
You need to know the math behind it. Now, the one thing that you can really take from this is all this talk about hop utilization and IBUs that actually get into the wort doesn't really translate to the IBUs that get into the beer. The only way you know the IBU of your beer is to have it lab tested. It has to be tested because during fermentation, the yeast actually eat up a lot of the IBUs, and we lose some to the true, and there's all these things that happen. So the math for IBU is pre-fermentation, and it's just a way of having a general idea of how much we utilize. Math still works. That's the funny thing. Even though they're talking about, well, it's not the gravity, it's the break, math for it based on gravity still works. That's why they use it, and that's how we figure out what we're starting with. There are 3 different math equations that can be used for figuring out the IBUs of your wort pre-fermentation. One is called Rager, which is the guy's name. One is Tinseth, and one is Gareth, I think it was. But we use Tinseth. So that's what this chart is. This is Tinseth's chart. What he has here is a gravity of 1040 at a 60-minute boil. You'll only get 0.25% utilization. You never get 100% utilization. You never get 1. You get about a quarter of the utilization. So the first thing you have to figure out is how much you would get at 100%. And that is called the milligrams per liter of added alpha acid. The way that's figured out is taking the decimal alpha acid rating of your hop. Let's say it's a 13% hop, that would be 0.13. And then you times it by the ounces of hops. Let's say it's 1. We're still at 0.13. And then you times it by this number 7490. And for the life of me, I don't know where that number comes from. That is a number to figure out the milligrams per liter here. And then you just divide it by the gallons of wort. So 0.13 times 1 times 7490 equals 973.7 divided by 5 gallons, and at 100% utilization, we could get 194 IBUs. Boy, would that be a hoppy beer, huh? But again, we have to take utilization into account, utilization being time and gravity. Since that says times that will be 0.252, and this beer would have 49 IBUs. That's how we figure it out.